You're watching This, That, and Theology Live. We're just about ready to start things up. We'll start right at 10, but we're glad you're here with us. Well, welcome back to This, That, and Theology Live. Glad that you're here with us on this beautiful Friday morning. At least it's beautiful where I am. Of course, that's inside of a studio, so I have no idea actually what it is like outside, but it is good to have you here with us. I know some of you are just kind of joining in, and glad to have you here. Matt, I see you're the first one there again, so another shout out. I know your kids liked that last time, so good to see you. We have a lot to talk about on this week. Not only are we going to talk again about the things that I'm doing and playing on PlayStation and computers and all those kind of things, what I'm watching, but we're going to talk today about one of those topics that I'm actually kind of excited about, but also has a certain degree of concern, and that's something like virtual reality. So if you are curious about this, never heard of it, this is going to be the day that you can kind of see that and see what's going on with that. Is that something you need to be concerned with? Is that something that's just a cool, exciting new technology? New tech is always one of those things we kind of have to worry about. We are, of course, going to start off first things first with taking a look back at your Bible reading for this last week. If you're using the 1 Year Bible, we talked about that last week. You can go to oneyearbibleonline.com and you can get a list there. This is a channel that talks about applying a biblical worldview to everything we're doing and everything around us. And so the best way to do that is, of course, to read your Bible. But yeah, so we're going to get started in a few minutes. If you're online and you have a question, you can go ahead and throw that in there, and maybe we'll have time to talk about that as well. I am going to start taking a look at emails. I didn't get any this week, but you can send things to thisthatandtheology@gmail.com. You can send that email to me right there, and you can see if there's a question or a topic you'd like to see addressed on one of these live streams on Friday. Otherwise, we'll just go ahead and get started. So for those of you who are waiting, I hope you've had a good week. We'll probably start actually tackling our first topic in a couple minutes. I just want to give plenty of time for people to come on. At least that's what they told me when I started doing streams. I looked at some of those online tutorials on how you can how do you maximize your live stream, and almost all of them said, "Hey, don't go right into your topic right at the first time because most people are still kind of trying to figure out." And again, for some people, you're going to be watching this after it has been streamed. So I'm glad you're watching as well. And if you are watching after the point, you can put it in the contact or in the comments rather. Go ahead and say replay team or something like that. I haven't really thought through tags a whole lot. It's that again, that's kind of new to me as well. This whole live streaming, of course. We live stream on Sundays at the church where I'm at, but that's an entirely different kind of thing. You're just kind of doing business as usual with a camera on, as opposed to trying to set up the green screen behind me, making sure I have all my slides and all things ready to go, and a good cup of coffee. All of those things are essential when you're going to sit down and doing one of these streams. Of course, I'm just realizing that I made that coffee half an hour ago, so it's ice cold. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? The first thing that we're going to talk about today is, of course, your Bible readings. And of course, if you're doing the 1 year read through the Bible, you can go to oneyearbibleonline.com and you can get a read through plan that's there. They have every day scheduled out for that the entire year. This year or this week, since the last time we gathered from February 10th to the 16th, if you're in the book of Exodus, all the way up through the first, second, or third chapter in Leviticus, that was your Old Testament reading. In the New Testament, we wrapped up Matthew, so we got to hear the Great Commission and the beginning of Mark's Gospel account. And if you're reading the Psalms, you're Psalm 32 through 35, and in Proverbs, you are on chapter 8, verse 27 through 9:18. Now that's a lot of reading, and if you were to sit down and do that all in one time, of course, that would be really overwhelming. But that's kind of the beauty of trying to space that out throughout the year. There's really two kind of Bible readings you can do. One is intensive study on one thing, maybe even soaking in a book for an entire month. I know about once a year or so, I'll find one book and I said, that's the only thing I'm going to read throughout this entire month. I think last year it was Colossians. That's a good study, but it's also good and helpful to kind of understand how all of the Bible fits together. And that is best done when you can read in big, large chunks so that you can understand the story of Scripture all the way through. It's not just a collection of short stories or verses that you can use as reference. They're actually a collection of stories from over 40 different authors that were guided by the Spirit. This is God's word itself. And there is a message that's consistent from the first verse in Genesis to the last verse in Revelation. But today we're going to actually talk about one of my favorite passages in the book of Exodus, and that's Exodus 32, which is the golden calf. Now, that may seem like a weird passage to really like, because in some ways it's a bit disturbing. Because you see God's people, Israel, who we talked about last week as being a unique people, that they were supposed to be separate from the rest of the world. You see them doing something that brings God's wrath right down on them. And it's a violent and a disturbing thing. But it does reveal something about not only God, but who we are to be as people who follow God. As you've been reading through the book of Exodus, you'll see this the plagues and the leaving of Egypt is actually a fairly small part of that story. You have that story to be sure, and it tells us, I believe it's in Exodus 9, that the reason that all of these things are happening is so that the entire world will know who God is and who his people are. And when you get into the section of Exodus where he's talking about how to build the tabernacle, he's talking about what you need to be doing as far as your practices of worship, how you're supposed to live your life, both even as a community and in your worship and kind of as a societal level, not just on your own life, but as a society. What you see is that God has a unique plan that he wants them to live in a way that is not completely foreign, but just definitely distinct. Even the way the tabernacle is described in its construction is very similar to what you would see in any other temple, but there were very clear distinctions that made them separate. For instance, in most temples, when you would walk in, there would be a giant statue right up there of the deity that you're worshiping. And when we see God giving Moses the instructions on how to build the tabernacle, there is no statue, there's no image of God that's in that place. So you can imagine it with all of this information, all of this to know, when you look down and Moses is coming down and he's hearing this ruckus that is not the sound of battle, but the sound of rejoicing, and yet it's not a good sound. They've already broken the second commandment. Now, they are saying that this calf is God, and that's an important thing to remember. They're saying this is the God who took us out of Egypt, and we are worshiping him. That this calf is a way for us to focus our worship, because they were looking at all the peoples around them, and that's how they worship. They had some sort of icon or representation. There was an idol that focused their worship. And so all of a sudden, all the people of Israel are celebrating God, but in a way that is so pagan and so like the world around them that it is absolutely abhorrent to God. And Moses reacts as anybody else might react in that kind of situation. He kind of acts in rage, because as he's coming down and he's seeing all the people celebrating and being excited as they're worshiping their idol, Moses is realizing this is the exact opposite of what God has said we needed to be doing. We're being just like the rest of the world. And even at that early stage, the people of God should have known better. God had given them specific instructions about their worship, specific methods, and they were breaking that. That was what part of their sin was in that moment, was that they were worshiping just like the rest of the world. Now, part of wanting to look at some of these passages that you're reading throughout the week is to find some way of applying that to today. And some of you may be going, we don't have golden calves. We don't have idols in our churches. How is this relevant? Well, even today, people, when they're worshiping, will often focus and do things that are entertaining and that may be exciting. They make for good videos. They make for an entertaining morning concert, but they're not necessarily worship in the way that God has prescribed. And you look at passages like Romans chapter 12, when it talks about the way our living is supposed to be different than the rest of the world. We need to make sure that as we are worshiping, as we are doing things in our lives, that they're consistent with what God has said we need to be doing. There's a trend right now throughout our society that says, I can worship God in whatever way works for me. You can worship the way it works for you. I'll worship the way that it works for me. And a lot of that includes things like moral decisions, things that are just like the rest of the world, but God has clearly said, no, you can't do this and still honor me. So, what we need to make sure that we're doing is that as we are looking at the week, as we're looking at how we're behaving throughout the week, as the way we're interacting with others, even the choices that we're making in order to glorify God, that we're making sure we're actually glorifying God and we're not glorifying the society around us. A lot of worship, a lot of even Christian practices aren't necessarily honoring God and they're not glorifying of him. So we need to make sure as we're reading our Bibles that we're making sure that our actions are consistent with the way that God would like us to behave and want us to worship. So if you have any comments about that, any insights or how that applies, go ahead and put that in the comments below. I'd love to see that. We are going to go ahead and talk about our next topic. And of course, if you're watching this afterward, I will have all sorts of chapter links put down below so that you can just jump right to the thing that you're wanting to look at. About 2 years ago, I started doing virtual reality. I was very excited about the Oculus Quest 2, and you, of course, can see Willy Wonka wearing that because that was totally in the movie. This idea of transporting yourself to another place, to interacting with something I had some friends who were into it, and he even had some channels on his videos on his channel where he would talk about the implications of virtual reality, and it's something that I really started to think about. And this week, we had the Apple Vision Pro kind of went live, and I was going to have a video here, but I guess I'm not having. I guess we're not having that. Um, the Apple Vision Pro became kind of a new thing. It was exciting, and a lot of people are trying to figure out what does this look like? Why is this a big deal? And like many things, when Apple does it, uh, when Apple does a thing, all of a sudden it becomes a major thing. So I think I have the commercial here still. I did preload all of these, and I was hoping that be able to work, but let's see. There we go. So as you can see, there's this interaction that you'll be able to just kind of bring all of these things right into your living room, and you'll be able to make phone calls, and you see them wearing it throughout the day, and it's just kind of a normal part of their life. And when the iPhone came out, there was already smartphones. We already had the ability to do emails and have your calendar all work together. I had a BlackBerry. That was probably the very first smartphone for many people. But with iPhone, even though Google had a halfway decent version had come out, that was a big deal. Now everybody has an iPhone, and even though uh, Android is still a pretty popular model, the smartphone as a technology is almost ubiquitous. It's something that you have that everybody has, everybody can use, and so with the Vision Pro going forward, I figured now would be a good time to talk about virtual reality. And the first thing to ask is, what is virtual reality? Because some of us think that it's just something out of like Ready Player One. If you saw that movie from some years ago, he was able to put the goggles on. He had a treadmill, and it was just like he was really there. And virtual reality today isn't there. It's kind of a halfway point. Generally, you have a headset that you put on that has two screens on the inside, so you have a stereoscopic vision. You have some way of interacting with that world. Usually, it's with a controller, and you have ears. You have sound, so that's stereoscopic sound. So it sometimes sounds like you're really there. And just by fooling those two senses, you're actually able to be transported into a whole nother place. I let a friend of mine try my VR headset, which again is a Quest 2, so it's the last generation. But they put it on and they instantly were transported, even though it was something more of a comic book level of detail. It definitely looked not photorealistic, but they were instantly transported and they felt like they were really there. And it was a really cool experience for them. And in that trying it, just in that one moment, they were all of a sudden able to understand why virtual reality may be something that there's a future in. It's not just a gimmick. Now, a little like I've always been quick to jump on some of these new technologies. I had the Evo 3D smartphone that had that 3D screen where you could watch 3D movies without glasses, and it was cool, and it gave most people a headache. So, virtual reality, is it just one of those kind of trends that may or may not happen? But again, because Apple has now done it, even with the really cost prohibitive price of $3,500, there are options that let you get into it. The Quest 3, which is the newest edition, can pick that up for less than half. In fact, you can get the Quest 3 and a really high powered computer to do some of the top end virtual reality games for less than it costs for an Apple Vision Pro. But since people may now be able to look at the Quest 2, which you can get for about $250, and a Quest 3, which I think is running at about 500, you can get that. It's attainable. People spend less than that. People spend more than that on their cell phones. And so is this something that can be used? Well, what do we use virtual reality for? And there's a couple of things that you can do in virtual reality that are really quite different. There's some positive things. VR chat. I'll talk more about this particular program. This is a social interaction app. You create an avatar. You go into a space. You can meet up with people and you can talk. My sister and brother-in-law have a headset, and I have been able to meet my sister for a virtual coffee date over VR. And yes, we're both in cartoonish avatars, but it almost felt like we were in the same room because the body language, head tilt, or even the way we move our hands, all of that was communicated in that virtual space. And VR chat, especially if you have something like with eye tracking, people who are using VR track with eye tracking are able to communicate their expressions, their mouths kind of match up. They can see when the eyes are looking here, there, and everywhere. It's almost like you're right there with that person. They're also using virtual reality for things like therapy. In the military, they're using it for PTSD. They've used it for temperature. They've been using it for therapy for who are burn victims. They put the headset on in a wintry seascape, and all of a sudden they're cooler. It's a way of helping treat them, even if they don't can't or if they can't take medications. Um, VR is actually great for productivity. If you're someone like me who can be easily distracted, you can put a virtual reality headset right on your head, and you can remove all of the things around you that might distract you. Now, this is a little probably too distracting for me. You see all of those different windows open, but you can actually take a zero space, you can make it quiet, you can actually meet up with people in virtual reality. I have actually done this, and it's been very productive, at least when I could figure out where my keyboard was. There are only a few keyboards that work in virtual reality, but it's a really cool way of hyper focusing so that you can really just look at one thing. Or if you do need to have four or five different things open, you can have that as well. In fact, that's one of the things that the Vision Pro does really well, is because it's pass-through cameras, which means you can see the world just outside of what you're doing, as well as the virtual elements. That does that really well. So you can have a giant screen up, and if somebody comes by, you can look over and talk to them. They may feel really weird looking at you with a screen literally strapped to your face, but it's very helpful and productive to be able to use that virtual reality headset in that kind of immersive work environment. But it's also just a lot of fun. This is a big screen app, and you may not be able to see in this screenshot, but you can meet up with friends in your own virtual theater. You can even throw virtual popcorn at the screen. They have spaces that are small so that you can interact with your friends. You can even play video games if you have your computer or console hooked up to the big screen server. I've talked about doing this with my daughter as well because she loves the Marvel movies. I said, "Hey, we could watch the original Iron Man in a super sized screen, and we could just do it, just the two of us with our VR headsets on. It would be really kind of cool." Um, it's amazing the way that they kind of get that set up. The screen lights are reflected onto the walls. It's a really neat experience, so that you can go to the movie theater and see Star Wars, for instance. Many of us were not able to go see the original release of Star Wars in theaters. You can use big screen, and you can see it in a big screen in a classic movie theater. They have some settings that are just like the movie theaters that were there when I was younger, as well as a more modern setup like the one you see here. And virtual reality is also really good for physical fitness. If you're playing a normal video game or a flat screen video game, you have a controller and you're looking at an image on a screen and you're controlling your avatar through the video game controller. Well, if you're in virtual reality, you are the controller. You're moving through space, and they have programs like this one, which is called Supernatural, which is actually designed as a physical fitness app. It's designed to help you move through space. In fact, I myself, one of the reasons I got mine at first is because I can't walk outside in the cold. I have messed up knees, and so being able to do physical fitness activities inside, not just the dance kind of games or games like Beat Saber, where you're swinging swords and breaking blocks, but also apps that'll track you when you're doing push-ups and sit-ups and all of those things that kind of gamify the act of physical fitness. They're really kind of cool, and yeah, they're fun. There are some really cool games. Again, I'm a Star Wars fan. There's a Star Wars experience that is really incredible. If you hook up virtual reality to your computer or you do something like PSVR, Star Wars Squadrons is a space flight combat sim where you're flying the X-wing or Tie fighter. And it is unbelievable when you're actually in the cockpit of an X-wing. You look forward and you can see all the dials. They all have a 3D shape. You really feel like you are in the middle of a Star Wars movie. It is really cool, and that is kind of cool. Virtual reality, while it hasn't necessarily broken into this realm of mainstream, when Quest 2 came out, there were over 2 million people who had purchased one and activated it during that season. Because, especially when we've talked about the social interaction point, Quest 2 came out just about the same time as COVID hit. And so people were stuck at home. They weren't able to go out, and virtual reality offered a way of having those social interactions that were more than just a phone call, more than just a text message, actually feeling like you were a part of that community. And it was done for, less than about the same cost as a Nintendo Switch. So that technology was timely for people to be able to start using it. And it is cutting edge technology, which means it's still in its infancy and we're still learning a lot of things. And there are some concerns that we have about virtual reality. One of the books that I often will quote is a book by Tim Challies called The Next Story. And in this book, Tim Challies talks about technology and how it changes all sorts of things. It changes the way we interact with each other, it changes the way we see the world. And as we've looked at technology, we can't just look at things from a theoretical or how might this be used or a practical or how can we use it now point, but we also need to look at things from a theological point of view. What does the Bible say about how we use this technology? And very often we'll grab on to things like television or smartphones, even the internet and virtual reality, or smart cars, having an electric vehicle or a vehicle that drives itself. And we'll think, okay, how does this work? How can it be used? And we're not necessarily thinking about it from a theological perspective. In other words, how does this reflect the way we live? We talked at the very beginning of our podcast today about Exodus chapter 32 and the golden calf, and how God does have an idea. In fact, he has prescriptions on how we're supposed to live. We need to take that same approach to these technologies. How do we use virtual reality in a way that honors God? And there are some concerns with technology. Probably the chief of this is actually uh, what it does to kids. Um, as we're looking at virtual reality being used, they the Quest 2 itself says you have to be 13 in order to use it. Now, part of that is because as we talk about technologies that have downsides, Quest is owned by Meta, which is formerly known as Facebook, and you are supposed to be 13 before you can get a Facebook account. And when you sign up with your Quest 2 headset, you actually need to use your Meta or Facebook login. They've changed it somewhat since, so you don't have to have a Facebook login. You don't have to link that to your page, but you do have to have a Meta login, and you need to be 13 to use it. And there have been some questions about development. Is it safe for kids to use VR, especially if they're below the age of puberty? Will it mess with the way that they're able to uh, interact with the world around them? I mean, kids are still growing. They're still learning spatial awareness. It's one of the reasons they fall over their own feet because they're not able to tell how they fit in the space around them. When you put a virtual reality headset in, you're literally transporting them to a space that isn't there. There's also the question young kids, especially, don't have the ability to understand abstract thought. There's also a disconnect from what is real and what is not real. They may believe, for instance, that Batman really is real. They don't understand that it's a fictional character because they can look and they can see on the screen, hey, there's Batman. It's the same thing with any other characters from fiction that we talk about. There is a disconnect between what is real and what is not real. And so using virtual reality breaks some of those things down, especially, again, I'm talking about Vision Pro just because it has such an incredibly high resolution screen that's right there on your face. You can actually interact with the world pretty well and put AR or augmented reality elements that fit in right with things. If you remember the movie The Minority Report from some years ago, starring Tom Cruise, They actually had screens that were on their eyeballs so that as they were looking around through things, those ads and those other things were showing up right there up on their screens, right there in their reality. And so being able to disconnect from that with right now, it's just taking off a headset. But in the future, as we continue to look at this technology developing, are we going to have that disconnect from reality? There's also a concern about escapism. As we look at things like movies and books and video games, it's an easy way for us to often kind of disconnect from the world entirely, to kind of run away from the realities that we all have to face. Virtual reality is some of the strongest disconnect that we can have as far as escaping from reality. And so we really need to be careful about how much of that we're actually doing. And virtual reality, especially if it's done for long periods of time, if you have one of those standalone headsets like the Quest or Vision Pro, there is a time limit because the battery can die. But there is a point where if you're in there for hours at a time, are you really disconnecting from reality to the point that's problematic? Probably my biggest concern with these actually comes in some of the games that we play and also things like, again, VR chat. I said I would come back to VR chat eventually. VR chat is one of those games that you create your own avatar. There are lots of places to go. I've likened VR chat to going to a city. And in that city, there are places that are good and they are healthy that you can go to. There are also places that are dangerous that you should try to stay away from. There is a red light district in VR chat. I have not been there, but I know it exists. And there's also, you said that disconnect from reality. I have heard some people, like Thrill Seeker, who is a very popular commentator on virtual reality, has a great channel for reviews, both of products and different apps and things like that. He talked about going to VR chat as really identifying with his avatar more than his real self. And in a day and age where we're very confused about who we are and how we fit in the world, uh, VR chat and other games. There's a game called Bone Lab, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment, where we start to identify more with our digital presence to say that is really who I am. Whether that means you're a small cat, I mean, if you're looking at that screen, I'll make that bigger. Those are just an example of some of the avatars that are there. You have a cat, you have an anime girl, you have kind of a futuristic punk, you have a robot, all of those things. If you're identifying more with that than you are with who you really are, that really presents a problem. We live in a society today that really is questioning what identity is and who gets to define what our identity is. And if you too strongly identify with the persona that you can create using virtual reality, it doesn't reinforce the fact that your identity isn't something you define, but it's something that God has given you. If you look at Psalm 139, it says that God knows us even when we were being knitted together. He knows who we are, both in our sitting and our lying down. He knows our every thought. In fact, the psalmist says, "It's too wonderful for me to imagine how much God knows about me and about how much God has created me to be." A lot of the confusion today about our identity and not really feeling like we identify with our identity comes because we try to identify ourselves based on our own experience. But God has designed us. God has created us. He has told us who we are. And that is one thing we need to be careful with whenever we have something as powerful as virtual reality that can actually give us the opportunity to define how we present ourselves to the world. I mean, if you were growing up at the same time I was, you know that even when AOL Instant Messenger came out and chat rooms, you wanted to be careful because you never knew who was in the room. If you're playing an online video game, you never know if the wizard avatar that you're looking at is a middle-aged man from the Bronx or a teenage girl from just down the street. You don't know, and in virtual reality, especially since there are apps out there that can even change the way your voice sounds, you may never know what you're looking at. There's also another concern that you need to have, especially as you're dealing with some of these games that are out there. I mentioned Bone Lab. Bone Lab was a sequel to a game called Bone Works. It is a completely physicalized experience. So as you're playing the game, you want to move through space. There is a way of moving, but if you're climbing, you're actually using your hands and climbing. If you want to shoot a gun, you have to pick up the gun, you have to shoot it. You're doing melee combat, you're doing punching. Very physical, very visceral. And in Bone Labs, one of the things they introduced was the ability to change your avatar on the fly, and that connects to what we were just talking about. You need to be tall and strong, then you can press a little button on your wrist, and now you're 10, 15 feet tall. Or you can be short and lightweight because you need to be able to get through those things. Or you can be, Arnold Schwarzenegger, going through the game, firing weapons. In fact, if you're firing a weapon and you're that short, lightweight person, the gun flies all over the place. If you're the Arnold Schwarzenegger type figure, you just point it and shoot like it's a squirt gun. It is fun, but the question you have to ask is, how much do we want to identify with those things? We talked about how we identify with our avatar and how people can identify with that. Well, it also means our actions. If you're sitting down to play a shooter, a first person shooter on the computer or on your console, you have a controller and you're controlling the image of the person that you're seeing there, but there's distance between you and the actions that are on the screen. If you're playing a platformer and you're doing all sorts of martial arts move against bad guys, or if it's a melee thing and you've got your sword and you're fighting through feudal Japan, you're still disconnected in a certain degree from the action that's happening on the screen. You press a button and your character will do something. When you're in virtual reality, it's you who are doing those things. I'm kind of picking on Bone Lab just because it is so visceral and it is a very interesting experience. There are scenes where you're having to use melee combat, and so you have to pick up the things around you as use them as weapons, including knives and swords. And even though the enemies that you're facing don't look human for the most part, you're still taking a virtual reality knife and you're physically plunging it into that person. There are other apps out there that don't have those same kind of digital amorphous figures. You actually have people who look like people, and you're grabbing them and you're hitting them and you're stabbing them or you're shooting them. You, as the virtual reality person, are physically doing some of those actions. And we want to be careful that we don't harden our hearts to the impact of those things. I remember playing one of those games in virtual reality and feeling a little disconcerted at the experience because I was taking a sword and I was having a sword fight. And once the adrenaline was gone, there was the reality that even though it was just a virtual person, I stabbed them through with a sword. And we need to be careful about the things that we're doing, even in video games. I've often talked about, maybe not here on this channel yet, but I've often talked about how the way we play games, whether it's board games or role playing games or even video games, how we play the game should reflect who we are in Christ. And so, as you're playing these virtual reality games, some of them are encouraging you and requiring you to do things that you may not feel comfortable with. Now, my favorite game in virtual reality is called Ultra Wings, and it's a flight simulator, and it feels awesome when you get into an ultralight um, aircraft and you take off. And again, because you're fooling your brain into thinking you're someplace else, it actually feels like you're taking off, and it's an incredible experience. But that same kind of connection to what you're doing in the game can still be with some very violent things. And also, again, I talked about VR chat having a red light district. Are you doing things in the virtual space that would not honor God? And we have to ask that question. And especially as we're trying to ask those questions, not just as consumers ourselves, but as parents and as we're dealing with children who are interested in doing those things, we need to ask those questions and be prepared because these are very serious things that we need to take into consideration before we give our kids access. Now, my son, on his 13th birthday, was given a virtual reality headset. He has the same Quest 2 that I do, so we can do things together, and it's a lot of fun. We do a game called Township Tale, where we're just the two of us in a very barren space. We're going and we're getting supplies and we're trying to restore this building. You can do games like Beat Saber where you can do those together. And so there's a lot of things we're able to do together as father and son in virtual reality, and it's a lot of fun. But you need to make sure before you give your kids unfettered access to virtual reality, you need to be careful just because it's one of those technologies we don't fully have an understanding of, and it's something that has its own dangers. So, what's the conclusion for all this? I know we've been talking for probably 20 minutes about virtual reality. Well, virtual reality and augmented reality means bringing elements that aren't real into your perception. So you're sitting in your office and you have a virtual screen, for instance. That's augmented reality. Some productivity apps are creating models of cars or buildings that you can interact with physically, even though it's in a virtual space. It has great potential for good, and we that's why I started with all of those things. There are a lot of really cool, very fascinating, really important things that we can do now with virtual reality that we couldn't before, especially in some of the fields like medicine and productivity, architecture, all of those things. These are really great tools. I love the social aspect that you get with virtual reality, but there are also things we need to be concerned. But the genie is out of the bottle. I keep referencing Apple's Vision Pro, not because I think it's an item that everybody's going to get, but because of the popularity of Apple, especially here in the United States. When Apple does something, all of a sudden it becomes mainstream. It becomes something that people want to have, want to be able to interact with. And so Apple's entry means that we're going to expect more virtual reality, more augmented reality, not less. It's going to become more and more commonplace. And so we need to prepare and learn how to use these tools for good. The printing press, when it came out, when they invented the printing press, yes, it meant that the spread of very negative ideas and corruption was able to be spread throughout the world. But we also got the Bible into everyone's hand because we could recreate scripture in a way that people could afford because it was now affordable to have your own copy of the Bible. Television, yes, there's all sorts of junk TV and immorality that is glorified. And yet, we have a better understanding of our place in the world and what's actually going on. That's a positive thing that's come from television. We talk about the internet. Internet is one of those huge things. I often liken giving your kids access to the internet a little bit like giving them a car. You need to teach them how to use the internet because it's a very dangerous place. Never before have we had such easy access to things like pornography and other negative things that are easy to access in the supposed anonymity of the internet. And yet, it's that same internet that allows us to talk like we're doing today, that we're able to have access to resources and information we've never been able to have. The Logos Bible software, for instance, fantastic software. You're able to access your Bible and essentially an entire theological library right from your computer. We couldn't do that if it wasn't for the internet. Social media has allowed us to be able to connect with people in a way that we haven't before. We're able to stay connected to family. We got on Facebook because we were disconnected from the rest of the family, and we wanted to post pictures so they could see that what our kids were born or what they were doing. That's a really cool thing about Facebook. But just like any other social media, whether it's Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, or any of the new ones that are coming out, or rebranding, if you're talking about Twitter and X, for all the good they have, there's also real danger, as we've seen in the interaction with Congress on the last couple of weeks, as the dangers that are there, particularly for young people, partially because we as adults, we as parents, haven't been prepared enough to actually help them interact with those things. And this is all true with virtual reality. We need to be ready. We need to be prepared to interact with those things in a way that is helpful, that is good for our kids, so that they can know how to use these tools for good. And we'll probably talk more about virtual reality and augmented reality in the future. It is one of the reasons I actually started This, That, and Theology channel, is because I wanted to make sure that we could talk about some of these things, because nobody is talking about virtual reality on a theological level or what it means for us as Christians to interact with the virtual space. So I really wanted to make sure that we talked about that, even this on our second episode of This, That, and Theology Live. This week, the things that I'm watching, reading, and playing, I am watching lots of reactions to the He Gets Us ad that aired during the Super Bowl. I don't know if you've seen that or not, but there are lots of ads that are out there right now with the Super Bowl that showed these images that look like they were AI generated about different people showing love and care to others. And it was implied that most of the people in those pictures who are being loved are those that very often Christians are accused of being hateful of. Well, I have seen lots of reviews. It's almost universally panned. People don't like it. People don't like it if they're Christians. They don't like it if they're non Christians. It's one of those ads that has managed to make everybody upset. And so I've been watching a lot of reactions about that because it has been a controversial ad series. They did it last year as well. I think it was a little less controversial last year as it is now. There's a great alternative ad that's called He Saves Us. I will put a link to that in the description below so that you can see that later. I really prefer that one over the He Gets Us because I think it better communicates what we mean when we're talking about Jesus. He doesn't just understand us, he came to save and redeem us. So I've watched probably too many videos about that over the last week than I'd like to admit to, but that's what I've been watching. I am rereading Ender's Game. It's one of my favorite fiction books by Orson Scott Card. It's about a young boy by the name of Andrew Ender Wiggin, who at the age of 6 gets sent off to battle school. And if you haven't read it or seen the movie, I won't spoil it, but it is one of my favorite books. It is definitely a must read for most people. In fact, I did hear that the Marine Corps made it required reading because it talked about battle tactics using your environment. I'm also finishing up a book called Identifying the Seed that's comparing two of the major systems of theology because that's one of those things that makes me excited. And I'm hoping to actually finish that up today at some point because it's not very hard and it's just a everyday man book read. I'm still playing Final Fantasy VII Remake in anticipation of the new game dropping at the end of the year. I've also been playing Flight Simulator, Microsoft Flight Simulator, and that has been very soothing and relaxing. It's again, I'm always looking for something that I can do while I'm listening to podcasts and sermons and things like that. And being able to fly over the United States in particular. In fact, I've done the route between my town here and the next major town to the north. I've done that a couple of different times in a couple of different airplanes. That's just been kind of fun to see how it's represented in a real world. And it was on sale this week. So if you haven't picked that up, it might be a good addition. Both on Steam, it was on sale, but you can also play that one on Xbox. Coming up in this next week, what can you look forward to from This, That, and Theology? Last night, I realized that I missed the release date for Argyle, and so I saw a late night showing of Argyle, and it was surprisingly good and remarkably clean with some caveats. You can expect a full review of that coming out in the next week. I'm also still working on those 3 Disney films that were re-released into theaters, both in January, February, and March. I've been watching Soul and making some notes, and you can see that also coming within the next few weeks. Well, I think that just about wraps us up for today's edition of This, That, and Theology Live. Thank you so much for joining us. I apologize that all of the videos and slides, other than a few at the beginning, didn't work. I preloaded them and queued them into Streamlab and or StreamYard, and they just disappeared right after I went live. So I apologize for that. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for including your comments. If there is something that you'd like to talk about, you can again email me at thisthatandtheology@gmail.org, or you can leave a comment in this video and I'll be checking that out as the week goes on. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next week at the same time, 10 o'clock Mountain Standard Time. That's noon on the East Coast, or I guess 9 o'clock in the morning if you're on the West Coast. I think of the 2 Disney parks, and that's where we're going from. But thank you for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic